Okay, picking up with chapter 11 to finish it up, we're talking about the Webster-Haynes debate and over union versus independent states or individual states and kind of the interests of states versus federal government in terms of nullification and the debate over the tariff. So Henry Clay, came up with a compromise. Imagine that. He always comes up with a compromise. And his compromise was basically going to reduce the tariff rates that had been the cause of so much of this, animosity between the two groups, and to pair that with a force bill. So the reduced tariff would appease the states, but the force bill would authorize military use to compel compliance with federal law in states that refuse to comply in future issues. So, for example, with South Carolina not wanting to abide by the tariff, if they had been in non-compliance with that or refused to follow that or to abide by that tariff, then the government could use military to come in and enforce that if they needed to kind of strengthen the enforcement side of that for the president or the executive branch, but also lowering the tariffs for the interest of the states at this point. South Carolina people were afraid of the tariffs. They thought that the tariffs could be used to end slavery because of just how it was changing the economic situation and putting so much stress on them. Andrew Jackson is going to urge that the tariff be enforced, but that the rates could be lowered. But not abiding by the tariff at all, he saw, could be viewed as an act of treason. Secretly, but not so secretly, he hated John C. Calhoun. A lot of it just because of how much he was heading up the state's right side of this. Actually threatened to go down to the South and hang him, and kind of expressed not hanging him later as one of his lifetime regrets. So he really did not like the guy. But Henry Clay is going to, like I said, he's going to lower it. Okay, moving on to Jackson's policy towards the Native Americans. Jackson's Native American policy, a lot of people see as one of his lower points, something that becomes very controversial for him. 1820s, 1830s, there's a lot of economic growth, reinforcing slavery, kind of accelerating the westward expansion. And with Andrew Jackson, his view of all of this is that the Native Americans need to get out of the way. His policy was removal. He wanted, first and foremost, to promote American expansion, U.S. expansion, and he sees the Native Americans as in the way of that progress. He relocates them to what people referred to as the Great American Desert, which was basically all the states in the middle part, the lower middle part of the Louisiana Purchase. So a lot of basically think Oklahoma up through the Dakotas, people just thought it was uninhabitable, just completely, not useful. Nobody wanted to live there, and so they just thought they could just kind of keep pushing them out of the way. Plus, Oklahoma was the farthest west point that they could put Native Americans that was in land that belonged to the United States up to that point. Looking at his Indian Removal Act, 1830, this authorized the president to give the Indians federal land west of the Mississippi in exchange for the land they occupied before. So it's going to be forced relocation of most Native American groups, and given a piece of land, many of them in Oklahoma, 46,000 are relocated. Very little resistance from most Native American groups. Most were bribed. Alcohol was a big selling point. There was the Black Hawk War that was one of the bigger armed resistance. You had a couple of big name guys that were involved in that one, in the fighting on the U.S. side, which was Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, the two presidents of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, president of the Union, and Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy. But you have militia was mobilized, you have the killing of women and children, and a lot of violence that went around this removal policy. Holding out as long as possible were the 5 civilized tribes. These were those that, Seminoles, the Cherokee, that had tried to do their best to civilize or Americanize themselves, setting up an infrastructure government, an education system, trying to see where they, kind of go, not getting rid of their Native American heritage and culture, but trying to, like I said, Americanize so that they would be considered civilized enough to constitute staying and not having to be removed. There were a couple of court cases that you guys looked at with the martial court cases in class that went along with these ideas. The Trail of Tears is going to be the forced relocation of the Cherokees. Cherokees were the last group to hold out. Many of them were in Georgia, North Carolina, and Georgia had declared the authority of the state law could extend over the Cherokees within the boundaries of the state. But there's going to be discovery of gold and other things that are going to prompt more people to push towards the Native American removal and to take over that land that was held by those last few tribes. Cherokees are going to try to get relief from all of this from the Supreme Court. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia ruled that the court lacked jurisdiction because the Cherokees were a domestic dependent union, not a foreign state. They had unquestionable right to their land. So trying to decrease the amount that the courts could come in and overstep the Native American land. Worcester versus Georgia also said that the court held the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community within Georgia, and Georgia law had no force over that. So Georgia law over the Cherokee Nation was unconstitutional. Very famous quote by Andrew Jackson. Because on these Marshall Court decisions, basically he said, Marshall has made his decision, now let him come enforce it. So basically disregarding what the Supreme Court has said about the Cherokee Nation and forcing their removal anyways. Okay, so sorry, phone ring. Wrapping up the video, or the part with Jackson's Native American policy, we're going to see that it's going to end with the forced relocation of the Cherokees. The forced march to Oklahoma, the Trail of Tears, 800 miles, a lot of cruelty, a lot of neglect for those who were on this march, and only 8,000 will survive. Most of everybody else will either die or go off on their own. There's the path of all the different ones. These five. Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole are the 5 civilized tribes, and this is going to be their relocation. And you can see that the green is all U.S. territory, and the purple here is the Native American reservations that they're relocated to, and then past this, which I know it cuts off the image here, but past this is all over here, land that is not yet owned by the United States. So basically the government was putting them in the farthest corner that they could. Okay, towards the bank. Jackson hates the bank. The question of rechartering the Bank of the United States was a big question at this point, and he was unrelenting in his conviction against it. It comes up around his re-election in 1832, and the original charter had expired and was renewed for the first bank. Jackson is going to make no commitment, but was very much opposed to this. He believes in hard currency. He felt the bank itself was unconstitutional. The bank controversy from the start, he feared that it favored the elite, and just basically was overall very much against it. Under Nicholas Biddle, president of the Bank of the United States had prospered. Government revenues are up. The bank had become very powerful in terms of lending money. The enemies of the Bank of the United States were the state banks. They had to decrease their money in circulation. Business and speculators wanted more money in circulation. You have a lot more conflict with interests. Calhoun is going to support the bank even though he's for states' rights, but many, including Andrew Jackson, argued that it had too much power in private hands. It did connect to the wealthy, but it also provided a stable currency. Jackson's going to question its constitutionality and start talking about some sort of a compromise. When people started to look at rechartering it for the second time around, Andrew Jackson, they thought if they could get the movement to recharter the bank moved up, Jackson would veto it, and that would hurt him towards his re-election. They thought that him vetoing the bank, enough people were in support of it that if he was publicly against the bank, that would hurt his political image. Biddle doesn't want to wait to recharter, and so they're going to bring it up. Jackson vetoes it, and then he ends up getting re-elected anyway, so it kind of backfires on them. Okay, so after Jackson had vetoed the bank, to basically remove the government deposits and to kind of solidify the early demise of that bank, he's going to remove the federal deposits and place them in his state banks that he is going to allocate. So that's going to be what he called as pet banks. Basically, if the bank doesn't have any money, then it's become essentially useless. So that's how he's going to help to kill off the Bank of the United States. The Distribution Act and Specie Circular, a couple of things on that one. Distribution of the government's funds to the states had been a project of Henry Clay's up to this point, and by eliminating a lot of the surplus, argument for cutting the tariff, a lot of this kind of going into Western property sales and Westerners looking to lower the price of land, so there's wanting a lower tariff. And so the Distribution Act was a compromise. The government would distribute most of the surplus as loans to the states, surplus money, and kind of satisfying Jackson's concerns. The funds were going to be technically deposits, so kind of helping with distribution of the surplus as a country and helping out the states as they grow. Specie Circular was one of the things that was something that was in favor with Jackson because he was a supporter of hard currency, and specie, as you remember, is hard currency, gold or silver, and so the government is going to now only accept gold or silver coins in the payment of land. Purpose was to kind of help against fraud. The paper currency was at this point very hard to regulate, but the irony was there's very little hard currency. It had been a problem since the beginning, so it's going to, a lot of the hard currency goes to speculators, people that would buy up larger parts of land and then sell it off in different ways to smaller groups of people. It did increase as a result. It did have an increase of inflation. There was a bit of some economic panics, 1837, because of kind of the overall results from the Specie Circular and having only hard currency. So there was a brief recovery, 1838, and then collapse of cotton prices and some depression later on. We don't fully recover until the mid-1840s. There was an assassination attempt on Andrew Jackson. Kind of a fun story because the guy who walked up to him tried to shoot him. Both guns failed, and Jackson starts beating him with his cane until his security pulled him off of the attempted assassin. Like I said, he's kind of a tough guy. A lot of people saw this as kind of an image of him, of King Andrew King Jackson, because of just kind of how he changed politics. But if you look at presidents from before him, John Quincy Adams and Monroe and Madison, he is definitely a very different personality than the ones from before him. So after Jackson, we see because of Jackson and going forward, we see the emergence of a new two-party system with the Democrats and the Whigs. Jackson people either loved him or they hated him. There were a lot of talk by the anti-Masonic Party and kind of looking into some popular hostility towards Mason members, suspecting kidnapping some people, secrets, all that, controversy and conspiracy ideas. The new party system is going to emerge with Van Buren. He's going to come in with the Whigs. Jackson had kind of killed off two big opponents with the nullification and bank ideas. Enemies of Jackson became known as Whigs because they thought Jackson is king, like you saw in the image before. His followers were kind of deemed as Tories. King Andrew and this whole coalition of Whigs centered around John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, very diverse. Even some of the Democrats are going to join the Whigs. Those who disagreed with the bank and the states' rights policies, the anti-Masonic remnants, all that's going to come in. They support Henry Clay's economic ideas, urban banking, commercial interests, planter associations within the South, internal improvements for those in the West, and seeing that as part of their campaign. The election of 1836, the two-party system reemerges. Jacksonians and anti-Jacksonians. Van Buren's support with the Democrats versus Daniel Webster with the Whigs, and those that kind of split up the other two parts. Van Buren does win, and first president of Dutch heritage, and he's going to inherit this panic of 1837, a drop in American cotton prices. The banks are going to cut their investments to America, failure of a wheat crop. All of this kind of goes along with it. 40% of banks are going to fall, and a lot of money in banks were lost as a result of that. The middle class suffers a lot of this, and Van Buren is going to be blamed for the Depression.